Well, as we get ready to hear from the Bible, as we begin Judges, just have a few things to say. Find my place. So what we're going to do is, because it's quite a long reading, we're going to break up the sermon and the Bible reading. So Liz will read a section and then I'll say a few words about each section. There are 5 sections, short sections. First we hear about Judah, then we hear about Caleb, then we hear about Judah again, then we hear about a town called Luz or Bethel, and then finally we hear about the other tribes. You might remember that the nation was broken up into 12 tribes. And Liz is going to be reading from the Message translation, so you might want to press that button, wherever it is on your screen, and follow along with the Bible reading, or use your paper Bible. It'll be a bit different if you don't have the Message translation. That's what it is. All right. So today we consider trusting God when things are hard, impossible, when they don't make sense. We see good and bad examples. We see God's promise to be with his people, and we saw a bit of that in the kids' talk, didn't we? To give them the land. Some people believe and act and trust and obey, and others don't. So I want you to be looking out for that in the Bible readings. One area that we need to trust God in, as we listen, is how we respond to God's command to his people to drive out the inhabitants of the land. And we're going to see that immediately in this first reading. Thanks, Liz.
This is from Judges 1. A time after the death of Joshua, when the people of Israel asked God, "Who will take the lead in going up against the Canaanites to fight them?" And God said, "Judah will go. I've given the land to him." The men of Judah said to those to their brother Simeon, "Go up with us to our territory, and we'll fight the Canaanites. Then we'll go with you to your territory." And Simeon went with them. So Judah went up. God gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites, they defeated them to Bezek, 10 military units. They caught up with my master Bezek there and fought him. They smashed the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My master Bezek ran, but they gave chase and caught him. They cut off his thumbs and big toes. My master Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to crawl under my table scavenging. Now God has done to me what I did to them. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. The people of Judah attacked and captured Jerusalem, subduing the city by sword, and then sending it up in flames. After that, they had gone down to fight the Canaanites who were living in the hill country, the Negev, and the foothills. Judah had gone on to the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Hebron used to be called Kiriath Arba, and brought Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai to their knees.
Thank you. Well, despite what it might look like or sound like, Judges starts off on a good note. You see, they ask God, the people gather together, and they say to God, "Who will take the lead? What are we going to do?" And that's kind of what we're going to do in the month of August. Not who will take the lead, but God, what do you want us to do? And God tells them. God says, Judah will go. Then, immediately, they ask Simeon to go with them. That's their brother, another one of the tribes. Now, here's a question. God said, Judah will go. And then immediately Judah asks Simeon. Now, here's a question. Are they being disobedient? Lack of confidence that they can't do it alone with God's help? Or is it just one brother helping another? It doesn't actually answer that question, but it does give us something to think about. Now, the story of my master Bezek is basically serving justice on him, and he acknowledges that. What he did to others is being done to him. In the next part, so we're moving immediately on to, what verse did you read up to, Liz? Oh, you read up to, okay, well, we have the next part now. Liz is going to read the next part, from 11 to 15, chapter 1 of Judges.
From there they had marched against the population of Debir. Debir used to be called Kiriath Sefer. Caleb had said, "Whoever attacks Kiriath Sefer and takes it, I'll give my daughter Askar to him as his wife." Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's brother, took it, so Caleb gave him his daughter Askar as his wife. When she arrived, she got him to ask for farmland from her father. As she dismounted from her donkey, Caleb asked her, "What would you like?" She said, "Give me a marriage gift. You've given me desert land, now give me pools of water." And he gave her the upper and lower pools. The people of Hohab and Kenite, Moses' relatives, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms to the wilderness of Judah at the descent of Arad. They settled down there with the Amalekites.
Great. Well, in this next section, the lens zooms in. I might zoom in like that, except I'm zooming in, on the family of Caleb. Caleb and Joshua, you might remember, we've already heard about Joshua. They were the only two of the previous generation who left who left Egypt to come to the land, to enter the promised land. Only two of them from that generation. Now Caleb basically issues a challenge. He says, "Whoever attacks Kiriath Sefer and takes it, I'll give my daughter Aksah to him as his wife." Othniel takes the challenge and Aksah marries him. Aksah then asks her husband Othniel to ask her dad for some farmland. Before Othniel even gets a chance to go to Caleb, Aksah does it herself, takes the initiative, and Caleb gives them the upper and the lower pools. Right, so we've got this family and the land. Then in verse 16, we hear about Hobab the Kenite. That was Moses' relative, his in-laws. They weren't Jews, but they also wanted to settle in the land that God had given to his people. In the kids' story that I read, the kids' talk, it's a story for everyone, isn't it? It was about going into God's place. Now that is really important. As a background to this story, you see, and all of the fighting, the wars, the idolatry that goes on, it's this idea, the big Bible idea, is that God has a place for his people to be. And the story actually reminded us that the initial place was the Garden of Eden. God had promised them when they were in Egypt, even before God made a promise to Abraham, that he would take them to this place, the land of Canaan, the land of promise, the promised land, that God said he would give to them. And in that place, they would be his people, and God would be their God, and they would live for him, they would obey him, and they would be a blessing. And all those ideas came out in the kids' talk as well, really well. That's what's going on behind the story here. God's people in God's place, under God's rule, and being a blessing, and receiving the blessing and passing it on. So we've seen so far that Judah have done the right thing, at least partially, depending on what that meant with inviting that Simeon. Caleb here and his family is a shining example, and Othniel and Aksah. And then the Kenites, Moses' in-laws, they also seem to want the blessing of being in God's promised land, joining with God's people. I want you to notice that in this patriarchal world, in the first chapter of Judges, we have an example of a godly woman not like Eve, Adam and Eve, who disobeyed God. No, this godly woman, Axa, she trusts God and she acts to receive the blessings that God has promised, the blessings of the promised land. She takes initiative and God blesses her. Similarly, the Kenites, Moses' relatives, the outsiders, not even part of the nation, maybe early converts, maybe, the first converts to Judaism possibly. They display faith, they display brave faith, promise, believing trust in God, wanting to come in and be part of this land, following along behind God's people. I wonder what it would look like to have a family like Caleb's family at St. John's, or outsiders like the Kenites. What would Caleb do and his family if they were at St. John's today, or this family? How do we take and receive and act on and believe God's promises like they did? What does that kind of brave, promise-trusting faith look like for us today? We'll come back to that, but I'd like you to be thinking about that. Now we're going to have the third Bible reading. Thanks, Liz.
The people of Judah went with their kin, the Simeonites, and struck the Canaanites who lived in Zephath. They carried out the holy curse and named the city Cursed Town. But Judah didn't manage to capture Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron with their territories. God was certainly with Judah in that, and they took over the hill country. But they couldn't oust the people on the plain because they had iron chariots. They gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had directed. Caleb drove out the 3 sons of Anak. But the people of Benjamin couldn't get rid of the Jebusites living in Jerusalem. Benjaminites and Jebusites live side by side in Jerusalem to this day.
So that was chapter 1 from verse 17. Notice now the tone changes. Did you notice the phrases? They didn't manage to capture. They couldn't oust. They couldn't get rid of. And that's contrasted with Caleb, yet again, who drove out the 3 sons of Anak. Notice that God was with Judah. It says God was with Judah, but still Judah couldn't oust the people of the plain because those people had iron chariots. That's greater technology. Othniel and Caleb are doing pretty well, pretty much by themselves it seems, but the whole tribe of Judah are struggling. Is God unable to help them against the greater technology of the iron chariots? Has technology beaten God? Well, it doesn't tell us the reason why Judah couldn't oust them, but from other parts of the book of Judges and from the rest of the Bible, it's likely that this is because Judah saw the problem. The enemies had greater technology. The enemies were stronger. They had stronger defenses, better means of attack. And so Judah decided that they couldn't. They didn't trust God, who had already told them that I've given it to you. But seems that they decided they couldn't do it. Well, let's have the next reading. From verse 22.
Yep. The house of Joseph went up to attack Bethel. God was with them. Joseph sent out spies to look at the place over. Bethel used to be known as Luz. The spies saw a man leaving the city and said to him, "Show us the way into the city and we'll treat you well." The man showed them a way in. They killed everyone in the city but the man and his family. The man went to the Hittite country and built a city. He named it Luz. That's its name to this day.
So in this second last reading, we have this story about Luz or Bethel. And as this story begins, we hear about spies, and we're reminded of the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, and we heard about that in the kids' talk. And you might remember the prostitute Rahab who helped the spies. But this story is a bit different. It's got a twist. You see, in that story, Rahab joins and becomes one of God's people, like the Canaanites. Rahab is even included in the family tree of Jesus in Matthew chapter 21. But in this story, which is quite different, Luz goes off, or the guy, the man, he goes off and he rebuilds Luz, the city that they've just destroyed. And it's kind of like, well, why did they even bother? There's no good result from that. Well, let's have the last reading from verse 27, chapter 1 of Judges.
But Manasseh never managed to drive out Bethshan, Tachan, Dor, Ibleam, and Megiddo in their territories. The Canaanites dug in their heels and wouldn't budge. When Israel became stronger, they put the Canaanites to forced labour, but they never got rid of them. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. The Canaanites stuck it out and lived there with them. Nor did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites in Kitron or Nahalol. They kept living there, but they were forced to put labour. Nor did Asher drive out the people of Achor, Sidon, Alab, Aksib, Helba, Aphek, and Rehob. Asher went ahead and settled down with the Canaanites, since they could not get rid of them. Naphtali fared no better. They couldn't drive out the people of Beth Shehem or Beth Anna, so they just moved in and lived with them. They did, though, put them to forced labour. The Amorites pushed the people of Dan up into the hills and wouldn't let them down on the plains. The Amorites stubbornly continued to live in the Mount Heres, Ajalon and Shelbim. But when the house of Joseph got the upper hand, they were put to forced labour. The Amorite borders extended from Scorpius Pass and Selah upwards.
And that's the end of the first chapter of Judges. You may have noticed the sad and discouraging note. God had asked them to come and take the land, and we have one after the other of this. They couldn't take it, and it's just sad how it finishes. We're not given reasons here why they couldn't do it, but the rest of the book of Judges, and this is kind of almost like a preview of what happens in the rest of the book of Judges, will show how God's people failed to trust God and how they lapsed into idolatry because these people stayed in the land and their religion was taken on by God's people, and they left God to follow these other religions. They put God second, third, or even last, or not at all in their individual lives, and even as a nation or as smaller tribal groups. So God allowed their enemies to defeat them. And if you'd have been listening carefully, you might have noticed even a bit of a progression. First, with the town of Luz, they just let one man go, and off he went, and he rebuilt the town in another place. In another place it says they didn't drive them out, they let them live among them, but they put them to forced labour, I guess used them as slaves. And then it changes from, first of all it says they let the people, the people, God's people, they let the people of the land live among them, and then it says they lived among the people of the land, and then finally they couldn't even drive them out. The Amorites wouldn't even let them live on the plain. Now, I need to say again and to notice that this warfare language is quite hard for us to hear today in Australia. I find it difficult reading. But the first thing we need to remember is that right now, in many places all over the world where they're not safe and comfortable like we are, where there are wars and atrocities, cruelty and rape, they see passages like this quite differently than we do. We need to remember that a common practice of the people of the land back then was child sacrifice. We're going to come back to, and it's going to come up pretty much every week, this holy war that's going on, the things that are all this violence. But I'd like that not to distract us from the important message that God is trying to teach us in the book of Judges. To trust God and to trust his ways. And actually this immediately gives us an application that we need to trust God even when we find these words difficult. But we will keep on struggling to understand them. So what is going on in this passage in the book? God is asking his people to trust him. Do you ever ask someone to trust you? Just say, just believe me, do what I say and it'll be all right. Or, I understand this. Will you just trust me on this one? That's what God is doing. He's giving them instructions and God expects them to carry them out, and normally exactly, which is probably why Judah shouldn't have invited the Simeonites. Now, while God is certainly a God of wisdom and common sense, and that's most often the case, he's also a supernatural God who sees more than we do. And there are times that what God asks might seem foolish, might seem hard, might seem not common sense, might seem impossible. That's what Judah thought when faced with the iron chariots. We can't do this. It's too hard. We won't. But it's not what Caleb and Othniel and Asa thought. Caleb had already seen what God had done when he brought them out of Egypt, and I'm sure he taught his daughter Asa. He knew his God and he trusted him. That's the lesson and the challenge for us today. Do we know our God? Will we trust him? When it seems foolish, when it seems impossible, when it seems just too hard. In lockdown, and we're in quarantine. We haven't been outside that fence really for over a week now. I'm sure that many of us are finding it hard just to do regular tasks, let alone anything extra for God. That's how I often feel. Sometimes it's an achievement just to get out of bed before 12 o'clock. I normally do that. Yet on the other hand, I've actually been able to start an almost daily prayer habit in the mornings. And that's helped me realise my dependence on God and to better pray for all of you. That's why I keep asking for prayer points. When we were going through a tough time, when we lived in Pakistan, when we were going through one of our toughest times, a good friend said to us, one of the CMS leadership, they encouraged us just to hang in there, not to give up. Just standing still sometimes, not going backwards is like as good as moving forwards. Maybe one step backwards, one step forwards. Not even one step backwards, 2 steps forwards. Keep trusting God. And God did get us through it. And here we are today. What would it look like for you right now, trusting God? There may be some of us, like Caleb and the Kenites, who God is calling to take a step forward for him in faith. For some of us, it might simply be not giving up, not giving in to temptation, to addiction, to grumbling, to complaining, to criticism, to negativity, to impatience, to unforgiveness. We have people in our congregation who are really struggling right now. I wonder, will you reach out in help, even if you're struggling yourself, in practical help, encouragement, in prayer? Say you'll pray for them, actually pray for them, and tell them that you have prayed for them. Encourage them and pray for them to trust God. Ask for prayer for yourself. Don't be afraid to do that. We're getting ready for a month of prayer at St. John's. I sent that out in the email. I mentioned it last week and we'll keep talking about it. A month of prayer and guidance. We don't know where God is leading us at St. John's. It's kind of uncertain times at the moment for everyone all over the world. Will God grow us? Will he double our size? Will we see people flooding in our doors? Will our neighbours, our family, our friends, our workmates suddenly become curious about Jesus and accept our invitation to come to church? Who knows? We can pray for it. We can believe. We can trust God that he can do it. Will God give us opportunities and the means to help the poor and needy, to advocate for justice in our society, to generously give away money to mission? Yes, he can do that. Will we pray for it? Will God maybe ask something less spectacular from us? And that's okay too. God may be calling us, as we are, to do great things. God may be calling us to work alongside someone else, to help someone else. Or he may send more people to help us. Or God might do something completely different that we've never dreamed of or imagined. But whatever happens, the hard news for some of us who don't like change is that change has already happened. Change is here, and we will continue to change. We've seen a lot of change. There's more to come, I'm sure. Not talking just St. John's, just in our world. It's impossible to stay where we are. It's impossible to go back to where we were before. How are we going to manage the change that God sends our way? How are we going to help those, bring them with us, those who struggle with change? How will we remain faithful to God in these turbulent times? Let me remind you of what I said last week when I talked about brave spirituality. I'm not calling us to do hard things, to be strong and brave and courageous, because I think that we're all super brave, competent people. Some of us are quite competent. Some of you are. But many of us right now are broken and weak. Humanly speaking, this is not the right time, not the wise time to be stepping out in faith and trying new things, humanly speaking. But we're doing it not because we're strong and brave, but because our God is strong. And we're only brave because we trust him to use us, to strengthen us, to give us courage, to make us brave. The failures in Judges were not because they didn't have a stronger army. Or they had bad battle tactics. That was a problem, but the bigger problem was they didn't trust and obey God. They didn't believe that God would be with them and strengthen them. They didn't believe in God's strength. Will we believe in God's strength? We obey God and we do great things because we trust him and his promises. People of St. John's, let's go into the week ahead in faith and trust in our great God. If that's a bit too much to think of, let's go into the next hour, the rest of this day, tomorrow, in faith and trust in God. No matter how weak or frail we feel, no matter how much sleep you got last night or how much pain you're in, no matter what circumstances, let's go into the future. Let's go into our month of prayer with faith and trust in God that he will use us for his glory, whatever that might look like, that he will guide us and show us the way, that he will grow his kingdom in our lives, in our families, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our neighbourhoods, and especially in West Brunswick. Let's pray and ask for God's help right now. Lord God, please help us. Help us to trust you when we feel weak and frail. Maybe some of us are feeling okay and strong for whatever reason. We're managing fine. Lord, whether we feel strong, whether we feel weak, help us not to trust in our own strength, but in you, in your leading, in your strength. Lord, show us, each one of us, what you would have us to do this day, how you would use us, how we can be obedient to you, what you would have us to do as your people. at St. John's. Please use us for your glory. In Jesus' name.